Most people believe power announces itself, in the volume of a voice, the size of a title, the speed of a rise. Power without noise argues the opposite, that the leaders who move the most, control the least visibly. This book is not a collection of borrowed theories or recycled motivational slogans. It is a working manual, built from psychology, behavioral discipline, and hard-won pattern recognition, for anyone who wants to lead a team, a company, a room, a life, without shouting to be heard. Across 15 chapters, you will dismantle the myth of the loud leader and replace it with a system, a set of mental models, daily disciplines, and decision frameworks that build authority from the inside out. Each chapter ends with a reflection you can act on immediately. This is not a book to finish. It is a book to return to, chapter by chapter, the way a craftsman returns to a well-worn set of tools. Packed with original scenarios and practical, step-by-step frameworks, Power Without Noise translates the hardest parts of leadership, restraint, patience, presence, into daily, buildable habits. You will not finish this book inspired for a week. You will finish it equipped for a career. Chapter 1: The Myth of the Loud Leader. There is a version of power that dies the moment it stops talking. Watch it closely and you will see the pattern, the voice that fills every silence, the opinion that arrives before it is asked for, the title that gets repeated until it starts to sound like a plea. This is not power. It is the fear of being forgotten, wearing power's clothes. Real authority does not need to remind a room that it is in charge. It has already arranged the room so the question never comes up. Somewhere early in your life, you were taught, by a classroom, a coach, a workplace, a culture obsessed with charisma, that leadership sounds like something. It sounds like the loudest voice in the meeting, the fastest talker in the negotiation, the person who can command a room the second they walk into it. So you learn to perform volume. You learn to speak first, to fill dead air, to treat silence as a vacancy that must be occupied before someone else occupies it. And it worked, for a while, the way a shot of adrenaline works, it got you noticed. But notice is not the same as trust, and volume is not the same as weight. Consider two managers running similar teams inside the same company. The first, we will call him Delhi, is magnetic in the way a fire alarm is magnetic, impossible to ignore, exhausting to be near for long. He opens every meeting with energy, narrates his own decisions as they happen, and measures his influence by how much airtime he occupies. His team performs, but they perform for him, the way a classroom behaves differently when the teacher is watching. The second manager, Amara, says less. She asks a question, waits the full 3 seconds it takes for someone braver to answer it, and only speaks again when her words will change the direction of the conversation. Her team does not perform for her. They perform because the standard she has built no longer requires her presence to enforce it. 6 months later, when both are moved to new departments, Delhi's old team's output drops within 2 weeks. Amara's team barely notices she is gone. That gap, between a team that needs you and a team you have built, is the entire subject of this book. The psychology behind this is not mysterious, but it is uncomfortable. Loudness is a nervous system strategy. When a person does not yet trust that their position is secure, their brain treats silence as a threat, an opening where someone else might seize the frame, redirect the room, or expose a weakness. So they fill it. This is not a character flaw, it is a stress response, the same one that makes an animal puff itself up when it feels cornered. The tragedy is that in modern institutions, we have mistaken this stress response for leadership potential and promoted it for decades. We have built entire management cultures around people who are good at looking certain, rather than people who are good at being right. Here is the paradigm shift this chapter asks you to make, and it will feel unnatural at first, because everything about your professional conditioning has told you the opposite. The less you need to say to move a room, the more power you actually hold. Power is not what you project. Power is what remains true about you when you stop projecting anything at all. If your influence evaporates the moment you go quiet, you were never leading, you were performing leadership, and performances require an audience, constant maintenance, and increasingly dramatic gestures to hold attention that was never really yours. But if your influence holds steady in your silence, if people still move in your direction, still hold the standard, still make the harder right choice when you are not narrating it, then you have built something durable. You have built power without noise. This distinction matters because noise is expensive. Every time you speak to assert rather than to inform, you spend a small amount of credibility. Say enough unnecessary things and your words stop carrying weight the way currency stops carrying value when a government prints too much of it. People begin to filter you. They start waiting for the signal inside the static, and eventually they stop waiting altogether. They simply tune you out and make their own decisions, quietly, without you. This is how competent people lose rooms they technically still control. They inflate their own currency until no one wants to hold it. So how do you build the kind of power that does not need volume to be felt? It starts with a set of practices, not personality traits, not innate charisma, but trainable systems anyone can build regardless of temperament. The first system is the 90% rule. In any meeting, negotiation, or conversation where influence is being contested, resolve to speak no more than 10% of the total words exchanged. This will feel impossible for the first week. You will bite down on opinions, watch weaker ideas take the floor, feel the itch to correct, to add, to prove you were tracking the whole time. Resist it. What you are training is not passivity, it is discrimination between the words that must be said and the words that only want to be said. After 2 weeks of practicing this rule, most people report the same discovery: the room begins directing its best ideas and hardest problems toward them, specifically because they have become known as someone whose words are rare enough to be worth the wait. The second system is the delay before the verdict. When you are asked for a decision, a reaction, or a judgment, build in a mandatory pause, 3 seconds minimum, 3 hours if the stakes allow it, before you respond. Loud leaders answer fast because fast answers feel like competence. But a considered answer, delivered a beat later, signals something far more valuable, that your words are the product of thought rather than reflex. In practice, this might mean saying, "Let me sit with that and give you my real answer this afternoon," instead of reacting on the spot. The delay is not indecision. It is the visible evidence that your decisions are worth the wait. The third system is narrating less, documenting more. Loud leaders talk about what they are doing. Quiet power lets the record speak. Instead of announcing your wins in the meeting, put them in a document, a report, a dashboard, something people discover rather than something you perform. Discovered competence is trusted at a rate that announced competence never reaches, because the audience feels they found the evidence themselves, rather than being sold it. The fourth system is the room read before the room enter. Before you walk into any high-stakes interaction, spend 60 seconds identifying what the room actually needs from you: clarity, calm, a decision, or simply your attention, before deciding what you will say. Loud leaders enter a room and immediately begin transmitting. Quiet power enters a room already receiving. This single habit, practiced consistently, will change how quickly people begin routing their real concerns to you instead of the version of the conversation they think you want to hear. Understand what is being built here. Each of these systems, practiced daily, is not a communication trick. It is a redistribution of where your authority actually lives, moving it out of your throat and into your judgment, your consistency, your track record, and the standard you hold even when no one is checking. That is the kind of authority that survives a bad quarter, a change in title, a room full of strangers who have never heard you speak. That is the kind of authority that does not need you in it to keep functioning, and paradoxically, that is exactly the kind of authority people fight hardest to keep in the room. Picture the version of you 6 months from now who has actually built this. You walk into rooms and the temperature changes before you say a word, not because you performed your way into that reaction, but because your name now carries a record that speaks before you do. You have stopped needing to win arguments in real time, because your decisions have started proving themselves on a longer timeline than anyone else in the room is willing to wait for. People start describing you in a specific way, one you will hear secondhand, usually from someone who does not know you are listening, when they finally say something, everyone stops. That sentence, not applause, not a title, not a promotion announcement, is the actual sound of power without noise. It is quiet. It is earned. And once you have built it, no one can talk you out of it, because you never talked your way into it in the first place. Silence is not the absence of power. It is power that no longer needs an audience. Power without noise. Chapter 2, The Weight of Stillness. Stand still in a moving current and you feel exactly how strong the water is. Everyone rushing past you feels only their own momentum, they mistake the current's speed for their own effort. This is the entire hidden purpose of stillness in leadership, not passivity, not indecision, but the deliberate act of stopping long enough to feel forces that motion conceals. Most people are never still enough, for long enough, to notice what is actually pushing on their organization, their team, their own decisions. They are too busy being carried by it to measure it. Picture a founder mid-crisis, 3 competitors having just announced a feature that threatens to make her product obsolete overnight. Her team is in motion within the hour, emergency meetings, rushed roadmaps, a flurry of half-formed responses fired off before anyone has actually confirmed the threat is as serious as it looks. She does something that feels, to her anxious team, almost irresponsible. She cancels the emergency meeting and asks for 4 hours of silence. No calls, no Slack messages, no reactive announcements. She spends those 4 hours alone with the actual competitor announcement, reading it twice, then a third time, and discovers, on the third read, that the threatening feature depends on a data source her competitors do not actually have reliable access to at scale, a detail that was completely invisible to a team moving at panic speed, and would have been buried entirely under a rushed response built on the first read's adrenaline. The 4 hours of stillness did not cost her team a competitive step. It saved them from building an expensive, unnecessary reaction to a threat that was never as real as its announcement made it sound. The reason stillness is so undervalued in professional culture is that motion is visible and stillness is not. A room full of people typing furiously looks like productivity, even when much of what they're producing is noise generated to relieve the discomfort of not yet knowing what to do. A single person sitting quietly, apparently doing nothing, looks like a liability in the same room, even when that person is doing the only work that will actually matter in 6 weeks. We have built entire cultures of performative urgency, where looking busy has become a stand-in for being effective, and the leaders most susceptible to this trap are often the most conscientious ones, because their instinct to be seen working hard is genuinely well-intentioned. It is simply misdirected. Here is the paradigm shift: stillness is not the opposite of action. It is the precondition for action that is actually correct rather than merely fast. Every impulsive decision made under pressure is, on some level, an attempt to escape the discomfort of not yet knowing by doing literally anything, as quickly as possible, to make that discomfort stop. Stillness asks you to sit inside that discomfort deliberately, past the point where it would be easier to simply move, because the information that clarifies a situation correctly rarely arrives in the first 60 seconds of panic. It arrives later, to whoever was patient enough, and secure enough, to still be listening for it. For practices build the capacity to be still on purpose, rather than only by accident. The first is the mandatory pause threshold. Decide in advance which categories of situation, a competitive threat, a public criticism, a sudden piece of bad news, require a fixed period of enforced stillness before any response is permitted, regardless of how urgent the situation feels in the moment. Urgency is frequently manufactured by the adrenaline of the news itself, not by the actual mathematics of the timeline, and a pre-committed threshold protects you from confusing the two when it matters most. The second is the second and third read. Whenever you receive information that triggers a strong reactive impulse, commit to reading or reviewing it at least 3 times before acting, once for the emotional impact, once for the literal facts, and once specifically hunting for what you might have missed on the first pass because you were too activated to see it clearly. The founder in the earlier example found her critical detail only on the third read. Most people never get past the first. The third is the physical anchor. Build a specific, repeatable physical practice, a walk, a set period of silence, a change of location, that you use exclusively to create stillness before consequential decisions. The body needs a cue as much as the mind does. A physical ritual makes stillness a trained, accessible state rather than something you have to will yourself into cold, under pressure, with no practiced pathway to get there. The fourth is distinguishing stillness from avoidance. Be honest with yourself about the difference between deliberate stillness in service of a better decision and simple avoidance of a decision you are afraid to make. The two can look identical from the outside, but only one of them has an endpoint you have already defined, a specific time by which the stillness ends and the decision, informed by what you found in the quiet, gets made. Stillness without a deadline is not discipline. It is procrastination wearing a more flattering name. There is a particular kind of clarity available only in stillness that no amount of frantic motion can substitute for, the ability to feel which parts of a crisis are structural and which parts are merely loud, which threats are real and which are simply moving fast enough to look real. Leaders who cultivate this capacity develop something close to a sixth sense over the years, an intuitive feel for when a situation actually requires speed and when speed is simply what everyone else in the room is doing because no one has given them permission to stop. Picture yourself in the middle of the next crisis that arrives, and one will arrive, because they always do, closing the door, silencing the notifications, and giving yourself the 4 hours, the walk, the second and third read, while everyone around you moves at panic speed toward a decision that has not yet earned the right to be made. When you finally emerge, your response will not be the loudest one in the building, and it will not be the fastest. But it will be the one still standing after everyone else's rushed reactions have already had to be walked back, quietly, by people who never learned to feel the current before they let it carry them. Motion feels like progress. Stillness is what tells you whether the direction was ever right in the first place. Power without noise. Chapter 3, Command without chaos. There is a specific kind of leader who mistakes intensity for control. Every deadline becomes a crisis. Every disagreement becomes a confrontation. Every Monday morning begins with a fire that, on closer inspection, was never actually burning, only smoking because someone needed a reason to run into the building. This leader believes that urgency is the same thing as command. It is not. Urgency is what you reach for when you do not trust the system to hold without your hands physically on it. Command is what remains when you take your hands off and the system runs anyway. Picture a restaurant kitchen during the dinner rush, the kind that looks, from the dining room, like barely controlled chaos, flames, shouting, tickets flying. Now picture two different head chefs running that same kitchen on 2 different nights. On the first night, the chef is loud, reactive, correcting every station in real time, and the kitchen's energy spikes and crashes with his mood. When he steps out to take a phone call, 3 tickets get fired wrong within 90 seconds. On the second night, a different chef runs the pass. She is nearly silent. She has trained her station so thoroughly that each cook knows the standard without being told twice, and when a ticket goes out wrong, the line self-corrects before she has to say a word. When she steps out to take a phone call, the kitchen does not even register her absence. Both kitchens survive the rush. Only one of them has actually been commanded. The other has simply been controlled, minute to minute, by a chef whose presence is the load-bearing wall holding the whole structure up, which means the moment he is gone, so is the structure. This is the central confusion this chapter exists to correct. Control and command are not the same skill, and most people who think they are natural leaders have only ever practiced the first. Control is moment-to-moment intervention. It requires your constant attention, your constant correction, your constant physical or verbal presence to keep the machine from drifting off course. It feels like leadership because it is exhausting and visible. You can point to the hours you spent, the fires you personally put out, the late nights you absorbed so the team didn't have to. But control that requires you is not a leadership skill. It is a personal capacity, and personal capacities have ceilings. You can only be in one meeting, one kitchen, one crisis at a time. Command, by contrast, is what you have built into the system itself, the standards, the training, the decision rights you have pushed downward, the culture that corrects its own drift without waiting for your voice to arrive. Command scales. Control does not. The psychological trap here is seductive because control feels like proof of your own importance. If everything falls apart the moment you look away, some deep and insecure part of you gets to feel indispensable. This is why so many leaders unconsciously sabotage the systems that would make them unnecessary in the room, approving every decision personally, refusing to document standards clearly, keeping key information in their own head rather than in a shared process. It is not always laziness or incompetence. Often it is fear wearing the mask of diligence. If the team can run without me, what exactly am I for? The honest answer, and the one this chapter insists you sit with, is that you become for something bigger the moment you stop being necessary for everything smaller. The leader who builds a team that runs without them has not made themselves obsolete. They have made themselves promotable. Here is the paradigm shift: chaos is not the absence of order. Chaos is the presence of order that depends entirely on one nervous system to enforce it. A kitchen, a team, a company that only holds its shape while you are physically watching it is not disciplined, it is dependent, and dependency is fragile in exactly the moments that matter most, because crises rarely wait for you to be in the room. Real command is order that survives your absence. It is the standard that holds at 2 a.m. when you are asleep, in the meeting you didn't attend, in the decision made by someone 3 levels down who has never spoken to you directly but knows, with total clarity, what you would want done. Building this kind of command requires 4 specific practices, each one a direct rejection of the control instinct. The first is writing the standard once, loudly, then repeating it rarely. Most leaders explain expectations conversationally, in passing, differently each time, which means the standard exists only as a blurry average across everyone's memory. Instead, write the standard down, the actual behavior you expect, in plain, specific language, once, clearly, and make it available to everyone. Then stop repeating it verbally except to reinforce it when it is met, not just when it is broken. A standard that only gets mentioned during failure trains people to associate your voice with correction. A standard that gets reinforced during success trains people to associate the standard itself, not your presence, with what good looks like. The second is the decision rights map. Sit down and explicitly define, in writing, which decisions your team can make without you, which decisions need your input but not your approval, and which decisions genuinely require your sign-off. Most teams have never seen this drawn out, so they default to asking permission for everything, which manufactures a bottleneck that looks like your importance but is actually your inefficiency. Publish this map. Update it as trust is earned. Watch how much faster the team moves once they are no longer guessing which category a decision falls into. The third is the absence audit. Deliberately remove yourself from a process for a defined period, a week, a project phase, a single high-stakes meeting, and observe, without intervening, what happens in your absence. Wherever the system breaks, you have found a place where you were practicing control instead of building command. That is not a failure to be embarrassed about, it is a diagnostic. Fix the gap by building a standard or a decision right into that spot, not by returning to personally patch it every time it recurs. The fourth is correcting the system, not the instance. When something goes wrong, the control instinct is to fix the immediate problem yourself, fast, so the fire is out before anyone notices you weren't watching closely enough. Command asks a slower, more useful question: what about the system allowed this to happen, and what needs to change so it does not require me to catch it next time? Fixing the instance makes you feel effective for an afternoon. Fixing the system means that specific fire never asks for your attention again. Understand the trajectory this puts you on. A leader who practices control accumulates more and more of the organization's weight on their own shoulders as they rise, until eventually the position collapses under a load no single person was built to carry. This is the quiet, unglamorous reason so many talented people burn out right at the level where they were supposed to finally have room to think strategically. A leader who practices command instead accumulates leverage. Each system they build, each decision right they push downward, each standard that holds without them frees up capacity for the next, larger problem. They rise not because they carry more, but because they need to carry less of what used to require them personally. See yourself a year from now, walking into a room where a decision is already half made before you arrive, made correctly, made in your voice though you never spoke the words, because the people making it have absorbed a standard so thoroughly it now runs on its own current. You are not in every meeting. You are not approving every step. And yet the organization does not drift when you are gone, because you never built something that needed your hands on it every hour to hold its shape. You built command. And command, unlike control, does not get tired, does not take vacations, and does not disappear the moment you finally, deservedly, look away. Control is what breaks the moment you look away. Command is what holds because you built it to. Power without noise.
Chapter 4. The Discipline of Withholding. Every piece of information you hold is a small transaction waiting to happen. You can spend it the moment you receive it, trading immediate relevance for long-term leverage, or you can hold it patiently until the moment it does the most good. Most people spend compulsively. They hear something useful and the pressure to share it, to prove they know, to be first, to fill the silence with value, becomes unbearable within minutes. This chapter is about the muscle almost no one trains, the discipline of holding what you know until it matters more than it does right now. Consider a mid-level executive named Tund who discovers, 3 weeks before a major reorganization is publicly announced, that his department will be merged with another. He has 2 choices, and both are available to him in the same instant. He can tell his closest colleagues immediately, a small, human impulse, born partly of trust and partly of the private thrill of being someone who knows things before others do. Or he can hold the information, say nothing, and use the 3 weeks to quietly prepare his team, restructure a few key responsibilities, and ensure the transition, when it is announced, causes as little disruption as possible. The first choice makes Tund popular for an afternoon. The second choice makes him indispensable for years, because when the reorganization lands, his team is the only one that was ready for it, and everyone eventually wonders how he managed that. He never tells them. That, too, is part of the discipline. Why is withholding so psychologically difficult? Because sharing information triggers an immediate, measurable reward. The small status bump of being the one who knew, the momentary closeness of letting someone else in on something private. Withholding offers no such reward in the moment. It asks you to sit on a valuable thing and receive nothing back except the abstract, deferred promise that it will matter more later. Human brains are notoriously bad at valuing deferred rewards over immediate ones. This is the same wiring that makes saving money harder than spending it, that makes long-term training harder than the dopamine hit of a single hard workout. Withholding information is a form of delayed gratification. And like all forms of delayed gratification, it can be trained, but only by people who have consciously decided the later reward is worth more than the immediate one. The paradigm shift here cuts against a very common piece of leadership advice, that transparency is always a virtue. It is not always a virtue. It is a tool, and like any tool, its value depends entirely on timing. Transparency deployed too early can create panic before a plan is ready to absorb it, can hand ammunition to people who will use it against you, can spend a piece of leverage that would have been worth 10 times more held for another 2 weeks. This is not an argument for dishonesty. It is an argument for sequencing, for understanding that when you say something is often as important as what you say, and that the discipline of choosing your moment is itself a form of respect for the people who will eventually receive the information, because it means they receive it prepared rather than blindsided. There is a second, quieter benefit to withholding that most people never notice until they have practiced it for years. People who share everything immediately are read, correctly, as easy to read. Their reactions, their knowledge, their next move are all available in real time, which makes them predictable, and predictable people are easy to route around, easy to out-negotiate, easy to discount in any room where advantage is being contested. People who hold information selectively become, without any effort to seem mysterious, genuinely harder to fully map. This is not manipulation. It is simply the natural consequence of a mind that has learned not to spend everything it knows the instant it knows it. 4 practices build this discipline. The first is the 24-hour hold. When you learn something significant, a piece of news, a strategic insight, a change in circumstances, commit to a minimum 24-hour delay before sharing it with anyone who does not strictly need it immediately for safety or compliance reasons. Use that window to ask what the information is actually worth, to whom, and when. Most compulsive sharing happens in the first hour after learning something, precisely when you have had the least time to think about its value. The second is mapping the audience before the message. Before you share anything consequential, identify exactly who needs to hear it, in what order, and why. Information shared broadly and immediately loses the specific power it could have had if delivered individually, sequenced to the people who could actually act on it. A piece of news given to the right single person a day early is worth more than the same news given to 20 people at once. The third is distinguishing sharing from performing. Ask yourself honestly, each time the urge to share arrives, whether you are sharing because the other person needs this information to do something well, or because you need them to know that you know it. The second motive is not shameful, is deeply human, but recognizing it robs it of its power over your decisions. Information shared to perform knowledge is spent for nothing. Information shared to enable action is spent with purpose. The fourth is building a private ledger. Keep a private, ongoing sense, mental or literally written, of what you currently know that others do not, and what each piece might be worth if held for the right moment versus spent now. This is not about hoarding for its own sake. It is about treating your knowledge the way a disciplined investor treats capital, aware of what you are holding, deliberate about when you deploy it, and never spending simply because spending feels good in the moment. Picture yourself 2 years into this discipline, sitting in a room where information is being traded carelessly all around you. People rushing to share what they know, competing to prove relevance, spending their leverage in real time for a fraction of its worth. You say almost nothing, not because you know less, but because you have learned that what you know is worth more used deliberately than spent impulsively. When you finally do speak, weeks or month from now, at exactly the moment your information changes the outcome of something that matters, the room will not remember how quiet you were before that. They will only remember that when it counted, you were the one who knew and knew exactly when to say so. What you withhold today is worth more than what you spend today. Patience is simply leverage that hasn't been cashed in yet. Power without noise. Chapter 5. Reading the room before you rule it. Every room has a temperature before you say a single word in it. And the leaders who move rooms most effectively are not the ones who speak first. They're the ones who feel the temperature accurately before deciding whether to raise it, lower it, or leave it exactly where it is. Most people walk into a room already committed to what they're going to say, which means they're deaf to what the room is actually telling them. This chapter is about developing the specific, trainable skill of reading before ruling, of treating the first 60 seconds of any interaction as data collection, not performance. Imagine 2 department heads walking into the same tense all-hands meeting, called after a difficult quarter. The first, certain of what he wants to say, opens with a rehearsed speech about resilience and pushing forward. He delivers it well. But the room, which was actually full of quiet fear about job security rather than a need for motivational language, receives the speech as tone-deaf, technically well-delivered, emotionally mismatched to what the room needed. The second department head walks in, says nothing for the first several seconds, actually looks at the faces in front of her, notices the stillness, the avoided eye contact, the particular quality of silence that signals anxiety rather than mere attentiveness. She discards her prepared opening and instead says, plainly, I know what everyone in this room is actually wondering. So let's start there. The room exhales audibly. She has not yet solved a single problem. She has simply proven in one sentence that she read the room correctly, and that alone buys her the trust to be heard for everything that follows. The reason this skill is so rare is that reading a room requires temporarily suspending your own agenda. And most people in leadership positions have been trained to believe that having and asserting an agenda immediately is the entire job. There's a real psychological cost to walking into a room without already knowing exactly what you're going to say. It feels, to the nervous system, like walking in unprepared, even when it is actually the opposite. The deepest form of preparation, one that adapts to reality rather than forcing reality to match a script written in advance. The leaders who read rooms, well, have simply made peace with a specific kind of discomfort, the 60 seconds of not yet knowing, held deliberately before committing to a direction. Here is the shift in thinking this chapter demands. The room is always telling you something, whether or not you're paying attention. Posture, pacing, who is looking at whom, which questions get asked eagerly and which get asked carefully, where the energy drops and where it sharpens. All of this is signal, constantly broadcasting, whether or not anyone in the room could put it into words themselves. Most leaders miss all of it because they're composing their next sentence instead of reading the one being written in front of them by everyone else's body language and behavior. Reading the room is not a soft skill in the dismissive sense that phrase usually implies. It is closer to reconnaissance, the difference between walking into a negotiation blind and walking and having already mapped the terrain. For systems build this capacity. The first is the silent 60. Before speaking in any meaningful interaction, a meeting, a negotiation, a difficult conversation, commit to 60 full seconds of pure observation before you say your first substantive sentence. Notice who is tense, who is disengaged, who is already agreeing with you before you've made your case, and might therefore be performing agreement rather than feeling it. This 60 seconds will feel enormous the first several times you practice it. That discomfort is the sign you're doing something most people never do. The second is naming the undercurrent. Once you have read the room, consider naming what you have noticed directly, the way the department head in the earlier example did, not manipulatively, but honestly. I sense some hesitation here, or I think there's a concern under this that hasn't been said yet. Naming the undercurrent accurately, before anyone else has dared to say it out loud, is one of the fastest ways to earn a room's trust, because it proves you were paying attention to them rather than rehearsing at them. The third is the agenda hold. Walk into important interactions with a clear sense of your goal, but hold your specific opening loosely, ready to discard it entirely if what you observe in the first 60 seconds contradicts what you expected to find. The goal stays fixed. The path to it stays adaptive. Leaders who rigidly execute a scripted opening regardless of the room's actual state are optimizing for their own comfort, not for the outcome. The fourth is the post-room debrief. After any high-stakes interaction, spend 2 minutes afterward asking yourself what you actually observed versus what you expected to observe going in, and where the two diverged. This single habit, repeated over months, sharpens your room reading accuracy faster than almost anything else, because it turns every interaction into a calibration exercise rather than a one-off performance you never examine again. There is a compounding effect to this practice that is worth naming directly. Every time you correctly read a room before acting on it, the people in that room register, often without consciously articulating it, that you see them accurately. That feeling of being accurately seen by someone in a position of authority is one of the rarest and most trust-building experiences a person can have in a professional setting. And it is available to you not through charisma or warmth performed on command, but through the simple, repeatable discipline of observing before you speak. Imagine yourself a year into this practice, walking into rooms that have started to feel, before you say anything, like they're already leaning slightly in your direction. Not because you have manufactured charm, but because your reputation now precedes you as someone who sees clearly before acting. People start to relax slightly when you enter, not because you are unthreatening, but because they trust you have actually looked at what is really happening before you decide what to do about it. That trust, quiet and cumulative, is the foundation every other form of influence in this book is built on top of. You cannot rule a room you have never actually read. But once you have learned to read it first, ruling it barely takes any effort at all. The room speaks first always. The only question is whether you were listening before you started talking. Power without noise. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Trust. Trust is not a feeling you inspire. It is a structure you build, brick by verifiable brick, until it can hold weight without you standing under it. Most people treat trust as something they either have or don't, a kind of luck of personality. Likable people get it. Unlikable people don't. This is a comforting lie, because it lets you off the hook for the actual work. Trust is engineering, not chemistry. And like any structure, it can be designed, tested, reinforced, and, if you are careless, quietly demolished by a single visible crack in the foundation. Consider two founders raising money for their companies in the same season. The first is warm, quick with a story, generous with compliments, the kind of person investors enjoy having dinner with. The second is precise, almost to the point of dryness. She answers questions with exact numbers, tells investors the specific risks in her business before they ask, and once, memorably, corrects an investor's overly optimistic assumption about her own growth rate in the middle of a pitch in front of his partners. The first founder raises money faster. The second founder's investors, once they commit, never ask to see her financials again. They simply wire the next round when she tells them it's time. 18 months later, the first founder's cap table is in chaos because the warmth that raised the money never built anything underneath it. And now that results are mixed, her investors have started asking hard questions she has no rehearsed answer for. The second founder's investors have never once doubted a number she's given them, because she spent her first meeting proving she would tell them the truth, even when it cost her something. That is the architecture of trust, not built from charm, but from the accumulated evidence that your word survives contact with inconvenient reality. The psychology of trust is more mechanical than most people want to admit. Human beings do not trust based on how someone makes them feel in a single interaction. They trust based on pattern recognition across repeated interactions, specifically watching for whether a person's stated intentions match their actual behavior when something is at stake. A single broken promise, especially a small one, is disproportionately damaging because the brain treats it not as an isolated event, but as new information about the underlying pattern, proof that this person's word and this person's actions can diverge. This is why trust is so much easier to destroy than to build. Building requires dozens of confirming data points, accumulated slowly, while destroying it requires only one disconfirming one, remembered vividly. Here is the paradigm most leaders get backward. They try to build trust by being agreeable, by telling people what they want to hear, by smoothing over hard truths to keep the relationship pleasant in the moment. This builds likability, which is real and has value, but it is not the same structure as trust, and the two can diverge sharply under pressure. Trust is built specifically in the moments where telling the truth costs you something, where the easy, pleasant thing to say is not the accurate thing, and you say the accurate thing anyway. Every time you choose accuracy over comfort, you add a brick. Every time you choose comfort over accuracy, even in a small, seemingly harmless way, you're quietly borrowing against a structure you will eventually need to hold real weight. For systems build a trust architecture that holds under real pressure, not just in easy weather. The first is the bad news first principle. Whenever you have both good news and bad news to deliver the bad news first, plainly, without burying it in qualifications or softening language designed to protect your own comfort more than the listener's understanding. People remember, with startling precision, who told them the truth when it was inconvenient and who made them find it out some other way. Being the first, most direct source of hard news is one of the fastest ways to build a reputation as someone whose word can be relied upon. The second is the promise ledger. Keep an explicit, even literal, accounting of every commitment you make to another person, deadlines, follow-ups, small favors, and track your completion rate against yourself, privately. Most broken trust isn't the result of dramatic betrayal. It's the slow accumulation of small, unkept promises that each individually seem forgivable. Someone who tracks and protects a near-perfect completion rate on small promises builds a reputation that survives the rare large mistake. because the pattern underneath, it is so well established. The third is naming your own uncertainty. When you do not know something, say so directly, rather than manufacturing false confidence to appear more capable. Paradoxically, leaders who are willing to say, "I don't know yet, but here's how I'll find out," are trusted more, not less, than leaders who project certainty about everything, because the audience begins to trust that when this person does express certainty, it is earned rather than performed. The fourth is the accountability loop. When you make a mistake that affects someone else, name it before they have to point it out, explain specifically what you will do differently, and then, critically, follow up later to show the change actually happened. Most people apologize once and consider the matter closed. The people who build the deepest trust close the loop a second time, demonstrating the correction rather than just promising it. There is a compounding return to this kind of architecture that takes years to fully appear, but once it does, becomes nearly unassailable. People stop verifying you. They stop double-checking your numbers, rereading your contracts line by line, hedging their commitments to you with contingencies. This is not naivety on their part. It is the rational response to years of consistent evidence, and it is the single greatest efficiency a leader can build into every relationship they hold, because verification at scale is slow, and trust, once earned, moves at the speed of a single sentence. If you say it's true, it's true. Picture the moment, years from now, when someone on your team makes a decision worth millions, or a partner signs an agreement worth their reputation, on the strength of nothing more than your word, without asking for it in writing, without running it past legal first, without the usual friction that governs relationships built on anything less solid than what you have built. That moment is not luck. It is the compound interest on every small, inconvenient truth you told when a comfortable lie would have been easier and no one would have known the difference, except you, and eventually everyone who has ever trusted you since. Trust is not what people feel about you. It is what they no longer feel the need to check. Power without noise. Chapter 7. Decisions made in silence. The worst decisions of your career will be made out loud, in real time, under the pressure of an audience waiting for you to say something. The best ones will be made in a room with no one in it but you, hours or days before anyone asks for your answer. This chapter is about protecting that room, building the private, unwitnessed space where real decisions are actually made before they are ever performed for an audience. Picture a CEO facing a decision about whether to lay off a struggling division, sitting in a board meeting where 3 directors are pushing hard for an immediate answer, their body language impatient, the pressure in the room mounting with every second of visible hesitation. A weaker version of this leader feels the social pressure of the silence, and, to relieve it, gives a provisional answer on the spot, something that sounds decisive but was actually generated by discomfort rather than judgment. A stronger version says, calmly, "I'm not deciding this in this room. I'll have an answer by Thursday." The directors are briefly annoyed. But on Thursday, the answer that arrives is not the answer that would have come out under pressure on the spot. It is sharper, more defensible, and considers 3 second-order effects that never would have occurred to anyone in the heat of that meeting. The decision made in silence, days later, outperforms the decision that would have been made out loud, in the room, in front of an audience whose impatience was never actually relevant to what the right answer was. Why does an audience corrupt decision quality so reliably? Because the presence of other people watching activates a different part of the brain than the part responsible for careful analysis, a social, reputational part, concerned less with getting the answer right and more with how the act of answering will be perceived in that exact moment. Under an audience's gaze, decisiveness itself becomes the performance goal, sometimes at the direct expense of accuracy. This is why so many consequential decisions, hiring choices, strategic pivots, difficult personnel calls, go wrong in a room where they are announced, even when the person announcing them is intelligent and well-intentioned. The room itself is a contaminant. The paradigm shift is this. The quality of a decision and the speed at which you are willing to announce it are almost entirely unrelated, and conflating them is one of the most expensive habits a leader can develop. Announcing quickly protects your image as decisive. Deciding well protects your actual outcomes. These occasionally align, but when they don't, the leader who has trained themselves to separate the two, who can tolerate the social discomfort of an unanswered question hanging in a room, will consistently outperform the leader who cannot bear that discomfort and fills it with a premature answer. For systems protect the silence where real decisions get made. The first is the standing delay script. Prepare in advance a small set of phrases you can deploy the instant you feel pressure to decide out loud before you are ready. Let me think that through properly and get back to you by specific time, or I want to check one thing before I commit to that. Having this script ready removes the improvisational pressure that often causes people to cave and answer prematurely simply because they couldn't think of a graceful way to say not yet. The second is the decision room ritual. Build an actual, physical, or scheduled habit for where and when your hardest decisions get made, a specific time of day, a specific location, ideally alone, away from the environment where the question was first raised. Treat this as non-negotiable for any decision above a certain threshold of consequence. The ritual itself signals to your own mind that you have left performance mode and entered analysis mode. The third is the pre-mortem in silence. Before finalizing any major decision, spend time alone imagining it has already failed 1 year from now and working backward to identify why. This exercise is nearly impossible to do honestly in front of an audience, because admitting the ways your own decision might fail feels like weakness in front of others. Alone, it becomes simply due diligence, and it catches errors that social pressure would have talked you out of examining. The fourth is separating the decision from the announcement. Once you have decided in silence, deliberately choose the timing, audience, and framing of the announcement as a distinct second step, rather than letting the announcement happen automatically the moment the decision is reached. This separation gives you room to consider how the decision lands, who should hear it first, and what context it needs, all things that get skipped when decision and announcement collapse into the same rushed moment. There's a particular kind of respect this pattern earns over time that is different from the respect given to fast talkers. People stop expecting you to have an opinion on demand and instead start trusting that when you do give one, it has actually been through a process. This shifts the entire emotional tenor of how your decisions are received from "let's see if this holds up" to "if they've decided, they've already stress tested it more than we have." That shift, small as it sounds, is the difference between a leader whose calls get quietly relitigated after every meeting and one whose calls simply become a plan. Imagine yourself in a future high-stakes meeting, feeling the familiar pull of an impatient room wanting an answer right now, and instead of caving to that pull, calmly protecting the space you need. You do not perform certainty you don't have. You do not let the discomfort of silence make the decision for you. Days later, you deliver an answer built in a room with no audience in it, an answer that holds up not because it was said with confidence, but because it was actually right. And increasingly, the people around you will have learned not to mistake the gap between question and answer for hesitation. They will have learned to recognize it correctly as where your best work happens. The room applies pressure. The right decision doesn't care about the room. Protect the silence where the two never meet. Power without noise. Chapter 8. The currency of restraint. Every reaction you don't have is a form of savings. Every insult you don't answer, every provocation you let pass without comment, every opportunity to win a small argument that you decline to take, all of it accumulates somewhere the way unspent money accumulates in an account you rarely check, but which is quietly growing all the same. Restraint is not the absence of power. It is power being deliberately reinvested rather than spent on something that would not have paid you back. Picture a senior executive publicly criticized unfairly and pointedly by a peer during a company-wide meeting. The kind of moment that seems to demand an immediate, sharp response to protect one's standing in the room. Two responses are available. The first is to fire back in kind, matching the peer's energy, scoring points in front of the room, winning the exchange in the eyes of anyone keeping score in real time. The second is to let the comment sit, unanswered for a beat too long to be comfortable, and then respond with something measured and almost generous, acknowledging the point that had any merit, declining to engage with the part that didn't. The first response feels satisfying for exactly as long as the meeting lasts. The second response is the one people remember 18 months later, when that same executive is being considered for a promotion and someone in the room recalls, unprompted, I've never seen them lose their composure, even when they had every reason to. The restraint was not weakness in that moment. It was a long-term investment that the sharp, satisfying comeback could never have made. The psychological difficulty here is that restraint offers no immediate reward, and every provocation is, by design, engineered to make immediate reaction feel urgent and justified. Anger, in particular, floods the body with a sense of righteous clarity. In the moment, striking back feels not like a choice, but like simple justice. This is precisely why restraint must be built as a discipline rather than attempted as a feat of willpower in the heat of the moment. By the time the provocation arrives, the decision needs to already be made because there is no reliable way to outthink a flooded nervous system in real time. Here is the reframe this chapter insists on. Restraint is not passive. It is one of the most active, deliberate choices a person can make because it requires overriding a genuine physiological impulse in service of a longer timeline than the one your body is currently operating on. The leaders who are known for their composure are not people who feel provocation less intensely than everyone else. They're people who have decided in advance that the immediate satisfaction of reacting is almost never worth what it costs against the account of how they are perceived over years rather than minutes. For systems build this currency deliberately. The first is the 10-second rule for provocation. When you feel the pull to react sharply to an insult, a slight, or an unfair criticism, commit to 10 full seconds of no visible response before you do anything. No words, no facial reaction, nothing that telegraphs what you are feeling. This is not about suppressing the feeling. It is about creating a gap between the feeling and the action, which is often all that's needed for judgment to catch up with impulse. The second is the cost-benefit flash check. In that same gap, ask one fast question. What does reacting sharply actually earn me here versus what does it cost me? Most provocations, examined honestly under this question, reveal themselves as not worth the currency required to respond to them at all. A small number genuinely do warrant a firm response. And having asked the question first means that when you do respond firmly, it reads as a deliberate choice rather than a loss of composure. The third is the selective response doctrine. Decide in advance which categories of provocation you will engage with directly. Genuine threats to your integrity, your team, or the truth of a situation, and which you will let pass by design, not by weakness. Having this doctrine decided ahead of time removes the need to improvise a threshold in the heat of the moment, when your judgment about where that threshold should sit is least reliable. The fourth is the delayed ledger entry. After choosing restraint in a difficult moment, take a private moment afterward to actually acknowledge to yourself what that restraint cost you and what it likely earned you. This step matters because restraint that goes completely unacknowledged, even privately, starts to feel like invisibility rather than investment, and people who feel invisible eventually abandon the practice. Naming the trade to yourself keeps the discipline sustainable over years rather than weeks. There is a specific kind of authority that only accumulates through this practice, one that cannot be shortcut through any other means. People begin to sense, correctly, that your composure under provocation is not an absence of strength, but evidence of a very particular kind of strength, the kind that does not need every slight answer to remain intact. This reputation becomes, over years, a form of protection in itself. People provoke you less, not because they fear retaliation, but because they have learned, through repeated observation, that provoking you simply doesn't produce the reaction they're looking for, and eventually most people stop trying. Picture yourself years into this practice, standing in a room where someone has just said something designed to knock you off balance, watching the old pull to strike back rise and pass through you like weather, without needing to reach for the 10-second rule anymore, because the discipline has become instinct. You respond, if you respond at all, from calculation rather than reflex. In the room, every room, eventually, begins to understand something about you that no single clever comeback could ever have taught them. That your composure is not for sale at the price of anyone else's provocation, no matter how good the deal looks in a moment. Every reaction you withhold is currency saved. Spend it rarely, and only where it actually buys something. Power without noise. Chapter 9. Building systems, not spectacles. A spectacle impresses once and decays immediately. A system compounds quietly and never asks for applause. This is the single most expensive confusion in modern professional life. The mistaking of visible, one-time effort for durable, repeatable value. The all-nighter that saves the launch feels heroic and gets talked about in the hallway for a week. The unglamorous process that would have prevented the crisis in the first place gets built by someone whose name nobody remembers, and it saves the company from 100 crises no one ever has to hear about, precisely because it worked. Consider two managers tasked with improving their team's client reporting process. The first identifies a reporting failure right before a major client deadline and personally works through the night to fix it, delivering a flawless report the next morning to visible relief and gratitude from leadership. He is praised in the next town hall by name. The second manager, months earlier, had noticed the same underlying fragility in the reporting process and quietly spent 3 unglamorous weeks building a template, a review checklist, and an automated data check that catches errors before they ever reach a client. No one thanks her because nothing ever goes wrong for anyone to notice. A year later, the first manager is still pulling occasional all-nighters, beloved and exhausted, personally patching the same underlying fragility every few months. The second manager's team has not had a reporting failure since the system went live, and she has quietly been given 3 additional accounts to oversee because leadership has noticed, in the specific way leadership eventually notices, that things simply don't break around her. The psychological pull towards spectacle over system is powerful because spectacle is legible in real time. Everyone can see the all-nighter, feel the relief of the crisis averted, attach a hero narrative to a specific person and a specific night. Systems are nearly invisible by design. Their entire value is that they prevent the crisis from ever becoming visible in the first place, which means the person who built them rarely gets to stand in the spotlight of gratitude that spectacle naturally generates. This is a genuine cost, and it is worth naming honestly. Building systems is a bet that long-term recognition, however delayed and however quiet, will eventually outweigh the immediate gratification of being seen as the hero in the room tonight. The paradigm shift is this. Your job, at any real level of leadership, is not to be the person who fixes things. It is to be the person things stop breaking around. These sound similar. They are opposites. The fixer's value is capped by their own personal bandwidth and is entirely dependent on their continued presence and effort. The system builder's value compounds independently of their presence, freeing their bandwidth for the next, larger problem, and quietly making the entire operation more resilient whether or not anyone ever notices who built the resilience in. For practices, shift your default from spectacle to system. The first is the repeat failure audit. Look honestly at the crises you have personally solved in the last 6 months, and ask which of them have happened more than once. Any repeat failure is a signal that you solve an instance rather than the underlying cause, and that the heroic fix, however satisfying, was actually a missed opportunity to build something durable. Treat every second occurrence of the same problem as a mandate to build a system, not perform another rescue. The second is documentation as a first-class deliverable. Whenever you solve a non-trivial problem, treat writing down the solution, clearly enough that someone else could execute it without you, as part of finishing the task, not an optional extra you'll get to later. Most valuable knowledge in most organizations lives undocumented in someone's head, which means it evaporates the moment that person is unavailable. A solved problem that isn't documented is only half solved. The third is the delegation ladder. For any recurring task you personally handle, explicitly identify what it would take to hand it fully to someone else, what training, what tools, what decision rights, and work through that ladder deliberately rather than continuing to hold the task simply because you're already good at it. Being good at a task is not, by itself, a reason to keep doing it forever. It's often exactly the trap that keeps capable people stuck doing low-leverage work indefinitely. The fourth is measuring absence of crisis, not just presence of heroics. In your own private tracking of your impact, deliberately give weight to the crises that didn't happen because of something you built earlier, not just the ones you visibly resolved. This is hard to measure and even harder to get credit for from others. But tracking it privately protects you from unconsciously drifting back towards spectacle simply because it's the only kind of contribution that gets automatically noticed. There's a long arc reward to this approach that spectacle can never match. The fixer, however celebrated, eventually plateaus. There are only so many hours in a night, only so many fires one person can personally run into. The system builder's influence keeps expanding long after they've moved on to the next problem, embedded in processes, templates, and standards that keep working whether or not anyone remembers whose idea they were originally. This is, in the end, a kind of leverage spectacle can never buy. The ability to be in 10 places you aren't physically standing in, because you built something there once that no longer needs you to keep functioning. Picture yourself years from now, walking through an organization you helped build, noticing dozens of small systems running quietly in the background. A checklist here, a process there, a standard nobody questions anymore because it's simply how things are done, and realizing that most of the people relying on them every day have no idea you're the reason they exist. That anonymity is not a loss. It is the truest evidence that what you built actually worked. It outlived the need for anyone to remember who built it. A spectacle is remembered for a week. A system is relied on for a decade and thanked by no one because it never gave anyone a reason to notice it at all. Power without noise. Chapter 10. The Art of the Long Game. Almost every visible failure of leadership, examined closely, turns out to be a failure of time horizon, a decision optimized for how it would look this quarter, this meeting, this news cycle, made by someone who either forgot or never learned that the scoreboard they should have been playing for runs in years, not weeks. The long game is not a metaphor in this chapter. It is a specific, learnable discipline. The ability to correctly evaluate a decision against a timeline long enough that its real value becomes visible, rather than the timeline short enough that only its appearance can be judged. Consider two competing leaders in the same industry, both facing pressure from short-term stakeholders to cut a research and training budget to hit a quarterly number. The first leader complies, hits the number, is praised in the next earnings call, and watches his stock tick up modestly for a week. 2 years later, his best people have left for competitors who kept investing in their growth, and the pipeline of new capability his team once had has quietly dried up, forcing an expensive scramble to rebuild what was cut. The second leader refuses the cut, absorbs a harder quarter and a testier conversation with the board, and holds the line on the investment. 2 years later, her team is producing work the first leader's team can no longer match, and the modest short-term cost she absorbed is paid for itself many times over in capability her competitors are now trying, and largely failing, to buy back. Neither decision looked dramatically different in the room where it was made. The entire difference lived in which timeline each leader was actually optimizing for. The reason short-term thinking dominates so much of professional life is not stupidity. It's that short-term outcomes are the ones that get evaluated, rewarded, and punished in real time, while long-term outcomes take so long to materialize that by the time they arrive, it's often unclear who deserves credit or blame for them at all. This creates a systemic bias toward decisions that look good soon, because looking good soon is reliably rewarded, while decisions that are good eventually often go unrewarded simply because the reward arrives on a timeline too long for most incentive structures to track back to their actual cause. The paradigm shift here requires a specific kind of discipline, consciously identifying for any consequential decision which timeline you are actually optimizing for, and asking honestly whether that is the timeline that actually matters. Most bad long-term decisions are not made by people who don't understand the long-term. They're made by people who understand it perfectly well, but choose the short-term win anyway, because the short-term pressure is loud, immediate, and personally uncomfortable to resist, while the long-term cost is quiet, distant, and easy to rationalize away in the moment. For practices, build the capacity to actually play the long game rather than merely admire it in theory. The first is the 10-year lens. For any major decision, explicitly ask how it will look in 10 years, not 10 weeks. This sounds abstract until you practice it. The discipline is in actually pausing to run the mental simulation rather than assuming you already know the answer. Decisions that look smart at 10 weeks and foolish at 10 years should be treated with active suspicion, no matter how urgently they're being pushed. The second is protecting the unrewarded investment. Identify the specific investments in your work, training, research, relationship building, quality standards that produce no visible short-term reward but compound significantly over years, and deliberately protect them from the recurring pressure to be cut whenever short-term numbers get tight. These are almost always the first things sacrificed under pressure, precisely because their absence isn't immediately felt, which is exactly why they need active, conscious protection rather than the passive protection of simply seeming important. The third is the credit delay tolerance. Build your own internal tolerance for doing work that will not be credited to you for years, if ever, by someone other than yourself. This is genuinely difficult and worth naming as difficult rather than pretending it's easy. But leaders who cannot tolerate delayed or absent credit will systematically avoid the highest leverage long-term work in favor of whatever gets acknowledged fastest, which is rarely the same thing. The fourth is the compounding review. Periodically, quarterly is a reasonable cadence. Review the decisions you made in the past that were built for the long game and actually trace what compounded from them. This step matters because the long game, without periodic evidence that it's working, starts to feel like faith rather than strategy, and faith is much harder to sustain under real pressure than a strategy you can point to concrete, growing evidence for. There is a specific kind of quiet confidence available only to people who have played the long game successfully at least once and watched it pay off. It removes a certain desperation from decision-making, the frantic energy of someone who believes this quarter is the only one that will ever matter. Leaders who have internalized the long game make calmer decisions under short-term pressure because they have already proven to themselves, through direct experience, that the pressure of the present moment is not, in fact, the entire scoreboard. Picture yourself a decade from now, looking back at a handful of decisions you made quietly, under real pressure to choose otherwise, that no one applauded at the time and few people even noticed, and watching the specific, undeniable ways those decisions have compounded into advantages your competitors, who chose the louder and faster path, simply cannot replicate now, no matter how much they're willing to spend trying. That is the entire promise of the long game. It does not reward you quickly, and it does not reward you loudly, but it rewards you completely, and it rewards you in a currency no one can take back once it's earned. The short game is judged by everyone watching today. The long game is judged only by the results. No one can argue with tomorrow. Power without noise. Chapter 11. Power through presence. There's a specific quality some people carry into a room that has nothing to do with what they say and everything to do with how fully they are actually there. You have felt the difference. One person can stand next to you, technically present, phone in pocket, eyes forward, and still feel like they're 70% somewhere else, already composing their next message, already halfway to the next meeting. Another person can stand in the same spot and feel entirely, unmistakably there, attention undivided, and the room organizes itself around that attention without anyone being able to explain exactly why. This chapter is about the second kind of presence, and about the uncomfortable fact that it cannot be faked, only built. Consider a mentor meeting with a junior employee for what both of them know is a routine, low-stakes check-in. A distracted version of this mentor glances at his phone twice during the conversation, answers questions accurately but generically, and the employee leaves the meeting having received correct information and having felt distinctly unimportant. A present version of the same mentor puts the phone away entirely, asks one specific follow-up question that proves she was actually listening rather than waiting for her turn to talk, and the employee leaves having received the same correct information, but this time, feeling seen. 6 months later, when that employee is deciding whether to bring a serious concern to leadership or quietly start looking elsewhere, the memory of which version of that mentor showed up in a routine, forgettable meeting will matter more than either of them could have predicted at the time. Presence is psychologically expensive because full attention requires setting aside your own internal narrative, your worries, your agenda, your next 3 tasks, and that narrative does not want to be set aside. The mind treats its own concerns as urgent by default, and staying with someone else's moment instead requires actively overriding that default again and again for as long as the interaction lasts. This is precisely why presence reads as valuable to the people receiving it. They can feel, even if they can't articulate it, that you have paid a real cost to be fully where they are, and that cost is the entire signal. The paradigm shift here is that presence is not a personality trait some people simply have and others lack. It is a resource, finite and depletable, that must be spent deliberately rather than scattered thinly across everything and everyone, which is the default failure mode of anyone trying to be responsive to too many things at once. A leader who is theoretically available to everyone all the time is often fully present to no one, because true presence cannot be divided past a certain point without disappearing entirely. Power through presence requires the discipline of narrowing, being less available in general, so that when you're available, it is complete. For systems, build presence as a deliberate practice. The first is the single-channel rule. In any one-on-one interaction that matters, eliminate every other channel of input. Phone away and silenced, notifications off, no glancing at a second screen, for the full duration of the conversation, without exception. This sounds simple and is nonetheless rare enough that practicing it consistently will distinguish you within weeks. The second is the reflective question. Practice asking at least one question in every significant conversation that could only have come from someone who is actually listening to the specific words used, not just the general topic, a detail, a phrase, a concern buried in the middle of what someone said that a distracted listener would have missed entirely. This single habit is the fastest way to prove presence rather than merely claim it. The third is the transition ritual. Build a brief, deliberate practice for the moments between interactions, a breath, a few seconds of silence, a physical reset that allows you to fully close one conversation's internal narrative before opening the next one's. Without this transition, presence degrades throughout the day as each conversation's residue bleeds into the next, and by the afternoon you are technically in the room, but functionally still half attending to something from a morning. The fourth is presence rationing. Deliberately narrow the number of people and situations you commit to being fully present for, and be honest, even if only with yourself, about which interactions get your complete attention and which get a lighter, more distributed version of it. This is not coldness. It is an acknowledgement that presence spent everywhere is present nowhere, and that the people who matter most deserve to know, through your consistent behavior, that they are in the category that gets the real thing. There is a specific kind of loyalty that presence generates which almost nothing else can replicate. People do not, in the end, remember most of what was said to them across a career of meetings and check-ins. They remember, with startling clarity, the handful of moments when someone in a position of power looked at them like they were the only thing that mattered in that room for those few minutes. That memory outlasts almost every other form of professional generosity because it touches something more fundamental than career advancement, the simple, rare experience of being fully seen by someone who had every reason to be distracted and chose not to be. Picture yourself walking into a room, any room, and giving it everything you have for the time you are in it. No fractured attention, no internal countdown to the next obligation, no performance of listening while actually composing your next move. People will not always be able to name what is different about being in a room with you. They will simply notice, over time, that they leave those interactions feeling more capable, more understood, and more willing to follow wherever you are leading. Not because of anything clever you said, but because of the rare, complete attention you were willing to spend on them when you didn't have to. Presence cannot be performed. It can only be spent fully on the person standing in front of you right now. Power without noise. Chapter 12. The Quiet War of Influence. Every organization runs two governance systems at once. The first is the visible one, the org chart, the titles, the official sign-off process, the meeting where a decision is formally announced. The second is invisible, and it is the one that actually determines what happens. The quiet network of whose opinion gets sought before a decision is finalized, whose objection is enough to quietly kill a proposal before it ever reaches a vote, whose casual comment in a hallway carries more real weight than another person's formal presentation. This second system is where influence actually lives, and most people never learn to see it, let alone operate within it deliberately. Picture a proposal moving through a company's official process, presented at a meeting, discussed openly, seemingly headed for approval. In the room, with visible authority, the person presenting it holds the floor. But in the invisible system, one senior figure who said almost nothing during the meeting has already, in a private conversation 2 days earlier, expressed quiet reservations to 3 other people whose votes matter. The proposal fails, technically, in a vote that looks democratic and open. It was actually decided in a hallway conversation no one in the official meeting ever knew took place. This is not corruption or backroom dealing in any sinister sense. It is simply how influence actually flows in any sufficiently large group of humans, and the leaders who understand this system, without needing to abuse it, consistently outmaneuver leaders who only ever engage with the visible one. The reason this quiet system is so often invisible to newer or more literal-minded leaders is that it violates the story we are told about how organizations are supposed to work, a story of open meetings, transparent votes, and merit rising cleanly to the top through official channels. That story is not entirely false, but it is dramatically incomplete, and leaders who operate as if it is the whole truth are consistently blindsided by decisions that seem to come out of nowhere, when in fact they were shaped quietly over days or weeks by conversations the official process never captured. The paradigm shift is this. Learning to see and navigate the quiet war of influence is not cynicism. It is simply accurate perception of how decisions actually get made, and refusing to engage with it does not make you more principled. It only makes you less effective, while the people who do understand it continue shaping outcomes around you, with or without your participation. The goal is not to become manipulative. It is to stop being naive about a layer of reality that is already operating whether or not you choose to see it. For practices, build fluency in this quieter system. The first is mapping the real decision makers. For any consequential proposal, identify not just who holds official sign-off authority, but whose informal opinion carries disproportionate weight with the people who do hold that authority. This map is rarely identical to the org chart, and building it accurately requires genuine attention to who gets quietly consulted before decisions are finalized, not just who speaks in the meeting where they're announced. The second is the pre-conversation. Before any significant proposal reaches its formal decision point, have private, individual conversations with the key people identified in your map, not to lobby aggressively, but to genuinely understand their concerns early enough to address them before the concerns calcify into a public objection that becomes much harder to walk back once it's been stated in front of others. The third is building quiet credibility before you need it. Invest in relationships and demonstrate a judgment with influential people well before you have a specific proposal that needs their support. Influence sought only in the moment you need something reads correctly as transactional, and is far less effective than influence built over time through consistent, unrelated demonstrations of good judgment. The fourth is refusing to weaponize what you see. As you become fluent in the invisible system, you will occasionally see opportunities to use it in ways that are technically effective but ethically corrosive, quietly undermining a colleague, spreading a concern you don't actually hold simply to kill a proposal you dislike for unrelated reasons. Resist this consistently. The quiet war of influence is a real terrain to navigate honestly, not a license to fight dirty simply because the fighting happens out of public view. There is a long-term cost to ignoring this system that many principled people pay without ever understanding why. They watch weaker proposals succeed and stronger ones fail. They watch decisions seem to reverse themselves mysteriously between the meeting and the memo, and they conclude, understandably but incorrectly, that the organization is simply irrational or political in a way that cannot be engaged with honestly. In fact, it is operating on a second layer of logic they have never learned to read, and the leaders who do learn to read it are not, by default, the most cynical people in the building. Often they are simply the most observant. Picture yourself navigating your next major proposal with full awareness of both systems at once, presenting clearly and well in the official meeting, while having already done the quieter work of understanding where real support and real resistance actually live days before the room ever convenes. You are not manipulating anyone. You're simply no longer surprised by outcomes that used to seem to come from nowhere because you have finally learned to see the second half of the map that was always there, quietly determining outcomes whether or not you ever looked at it directly. Every organization has two votes, the one taken in the room and the one already decided before the room convened. Learn to see both. Power without noise. Chapter 13, Leading Without Applause. There will be years of your leadership, if you're doing it correctly, where almost no one thanks you for the hardest and most important work you did. The applause, when it comes at all, tends to land on the visible moment, not the invisible groundwork that made the visible moment possible. This chapter exists to prepare you for that gap, because leaders who have not made peace with it in advance tend to distort their own behavior, consciously or not, to chase the applause instead of the outcome, and those are not always the same target. Consider an operations leader who spends 2 years quietly rebuilding a company's broken supply chain, absorbing criticism the entire time for the slow, unglamorous pace of the work, while a colleague in a different department launches a flashy new product initiative that gets covered in the company newsletter every month. The operations leader's work produces no headlines, because functioning supply chains don't make headlines. Only broken ones do, and hers has stopped breaking. When the company weathers a supply crisis that would have devastated a competitor, almost no one connects that resilience back to 2 years of unglamorous work that predates the crisis by so long most people have forgotten it happened. The flashy product, meanwhile, quietly underperforms its launch hype within a year, but by then the applause has already been banked, the promotion already been given, the narrative already been written. If the operations leader had been chasing applause instead of the actual outcome, she would have abandoned the supply chain work within 6 months for something more visible. She didn't because she had already made peace with doing the work that mattered more than the work that would be noticed. The psychological difficulty here is that applause is a genuine human need, not a shallow one, and pretending you don't want it is its own kind of dishonesty. The goal of this chapter is not to convince you that recognition doesn't matter. It is to help you separate the craving for recognition from the decisions you make about what work to actually do. Because when those two things fuse together, when you start unconsciously selecting projects based on their visibility rather than their actual value, your effectiveness as a leader degrades in ways that are very hard to see from the inside, precisely because the applause you're still receiving disguises the drift. The paradigm shift is this. The correlation between how loudly work is applauded and how much it actually matters is far weaker than most professional cultures assume, and often runs in the opposite direction entirely. The most consequential work is frequently invisible by nature, prevention rather than rescue, maintenance rather than launch, the quiet fix that means the crisis never happened rather than the dramatic response to a crisis that did. Leading well means developing the internal fortitude to keep choosing that invisible work even when the applause is reliably, predictably going to land somewhere else. For practices, build this fortitude. The first is the private scorecard. Keep your own honest, private accounting of the work you consider most valuable, independent of which parts of it get external recognition. This scorecard is for you alone. Its purpose is to give you a stable internal reference point so that the absence of applause on any given project doesn't get mistaken, even unconsciously, for evidence that the project didn't matter. The second is naming the trade consciously. When you choose unglamorous, high-value work over visible, applause-generating work, name that trade-off to yourself explicitly rather than letting it happen passively. I am choosing the harder, quieter path because I believe it matters more, and I'm accepting that I may not be thanked for it, is a different, more sustainable internal stance than simply doing the work and feeling vaguely resentful later that no one noticed. The third is building a small circle of real witnesses. While broad applause may never arrive for your most important work, cultivate a small number of people, a mentor, a peer, a trusted colleague, who genuinely understand what you're building and can see its value even when the wider organization can't. This is not a substitute for recognition. It is a sustainable source of the specific kind of seen-ness that keeps quiet work bearable over years rather than months. The fourth is celebrating others' visible wins generously. Paradoxically, one of the most stabilizing practices for someone doing unglamorous work is to be genuinely, visibly generous in celebrating colleagues whose more visible work does get applauded. This inoculates you against the quiet resentment that can otherwise build when you're constantly comparing your invisible contribution to someone else's visible one. And it builds exactly the kind of reputation, as someone secure enough not to need every win to be their own, that eventually earns its own quieter, more durable form of respect. There is a specific piece available to leaders who have genuinely made this trade, one that people chasing applause never quite reach, because their satisfaction remains permanently dependent on an external audience's attention, which is fickle, distractible, and frequently pointed at the wrong thing entirely. Leaders who have made peace with working largely without applause develop a satisfaction that comes from inside the work itself, from knowing, with or without anyone else's confirmation, that what they built actually held. Picture yourself years into a body of work that has earned you far less applause than its actual value would justify, and noticing that you no longer need the ledger to balance in public to know it balances. You have built the internal capacity to do the quiet, correct thing over and over, trusting the compounding value of the work itself rather than waiting for a room to confirm it mattered. That trust, once built, cannot be taken from you by anyone who simply chooses to applaud somewhere else. The most important work you ever do may never be applauded. Do it anyway. The outcome was never waiting for permission to matter. Power without noise. Chapter 14. The Legacy of Unspoken Strength. What people remember about a leader, years after they've left the room, is almost never a specific sentence. It is a feeling, the quality of how it felt to be led by that person, distilled down past the details into something closer to a texture than a memory. This chapter is about the legacy that gets built not through what you announce about yourself, but through the accumulated, unspoken evidence of how you actually behaved when it counted, evidence other people carry forward long after the specifics have blurred. Consider a retiring plant manager, remembered by workers who cycled through his facility across 3 decades, most of whom could not recall a single specific thing he ever said in a meeting. What they remembered, instead, was that during a period of serious financial strain, he took a personal pay cut before asking anyone on the floor to take one. And he did it quietly, without an announcement, and most people only found out about it years later, secondhand, from someone in accounting. That single unpublicized act, discovered rather than announced, did more to build his legacy across 3 decades than any speech he ever gave, because it was never designed to be discovered. It simply was what he did, and the discovery of it, incidental and unplanned, carried a weight that a deliberate announcement of the same sacrifice never could have matched. The reason unspoken strength builds a deeper legacy than announced strength is rooted in how humans evaluate sincerity. An action performed for an audience is immediately suspect, even when the action itself is genuinely good, because the audience can never fully separate the goodness of the act from the fact that it was performed in front of them. An action performed with no expectation of being seen, discovered only by accident or over time, carries none of that suspicion. It is read, correctly, as evidence of character rather than evidence of a performance of character, and that distinction is exactly what makes it so much more durable in the memory of everyone who eventually learns of it. The paradigm shift here is a genuinely difficult one, because it asks you to do good, difficult, costly things with no guarantee that anyone will ever know you did them, and to find that acceptable, even preferable, rather than treating the absence of recognition as a reason to withhold the action or to publicize it after the fact. Legacy built this way accumulates slower than legacy built through visible achievement, but it accumulates in a currency that visible achievement cannot buy. The specific, hard-won trust of people who happen to discover, unprompted, exactly who you were when you thought no one was measuring. For practices, build this kind of legacy deliberately. The first is the undocumented kindness. Practice doing at least some of your most costly, generous acts, covering for someone's mistake, quietly correcting an unfair situation, personally absorbing a hit that could have been passed downward without ever documenting or mentioning that you did it. This trains the habit of acting from principle rather than from the expectation of credit. And over years, the accumulated undocumented record becomes, paradoxically, one of the most documented aspects of your reputation once enough people happen to discover pieces of it independently. The second is correcting the record only when necessary. When someone else takes credit for something you actually did, resist the reflexive urge to correct it publicly unless leaving it uncorrected would cause genuine harm to you, to the truth, or to someone else who deserves the credit more directly. Most instances of stolen or misattributed credit are not, in the long run, worth the cost of a public correction, and a reputation for not needing to publicly claim every contribution becomes, itself, part of the unspoken strength this chapter describes. The third is the long silence after sacrifice. When you make a significant, costly sacrifice for your team or organization, resist the urge to reference it again afterward, even indirectly, even as a joke, even years later when it might be relevant context. Let the sacrifice remain a single, complete act rather than something you continue to draw social capital from indefinitely. This is one of the hardest disciplines in this book, because referencing past sacrifice for ongoing credit is an extremely common, almost automatic human behavior, and resisting it entirely is exactly what separates unspoken strength from strength that was merely delayed in its self-promotion. The fourth is trusting the discovery. Accept, as a working principle, that the people who matter most will eventually discover the true shape of your character through patterns of behavior rather than through anything you tell them directly, and that this discovery, though slower and less controllable than self-promotion, produces a far more durable and far more trusted understanding of who you actually are. This requires patience that runs contrary to almost every incentive in a fast-moving professional culture. It is also, of everything in this book, perhaps the single practice most responsible for the kind of legacy that outlives an entire career. There's a specific kind of immortality available to leaders who build their legacy this way. Not the immortality of a name on a building, but the quieter, more durable immortality of standard that gets passed down informally, person to person, long after anyone remembers exactly where it started. That's just how we do things here is, more often than professional culture likes to admit, a direct descendant of one person's unspoken, uncelebrated choices, made consistently enough for long enough that they eventually stopped being one person's choices and became simply how the place worked. Picture your own legacy decades from now, existing not as a speech anyone remembers or an award on a wall, but as a texture in the way people who once worked with you now treat the people who work for them, a standard of quiet integrity they picked up from watching you, that they now pass forward without ever quite remembering or needing to remember where it originally came from. That is the deepest form of leadership legacy available, and it is built entirely out of the things you never said. The strongest legacies are built from what was never announced. What people discover about your character outlasts anything you ever told them about it. Power without noise. Chapter 15. The leader who doesn't need to prove it. There is a final threshold in the development of quiet power, and it is the hardest one to cross because it requires letting go of something that got you every result up to this point, the need to prove yourself. Everything in this book has been, in some sense, a set of tools for building real, durable authority. This final chapter is about what happens after those tools have done their work, about the leader who has built enough evidence over enough years that they no longer feel a compulsion to demonstrate their competence in every room they enter, because the demonstration is no longer necessary. The record already speaks. The leader has simply stopped needing to narrate it. Picture a highly accomplished executive sitting in a meeting where a much younger colleague, unaware of her history, explains a concept to her that she has, in fact, forgotten more about than he currently knows, confidently, at length, slightly condescendingly. An earlier version of this executive, years ago, would have felt a sharp, immediate need to correct the record, to establish her actual expertise, to make sure the room understood who she really was relative to the person currently explaining her own field back to her. The version of her sitting in that meeting today simply lets him finish, asks a genuinely curious follow-up question, and moves on. She does not need the room to know what she knows. She already knows what she knows, and that has become, quietly, sufficient. This is not passivity born of low confidence. It is the opposite, a confidence so settled it no longer requires external confirmation to remain intact. The psychological work required to reach this point is considerable, because the need to prove yourself is rarely about the specific situation in front of you. It is almost always rooted in an older, deeper uncertainty about your own worth, one that each individual proof was always trying and always failing to permanently resolve. You cannot outachieve an internal sense of insecurity. Every accomplishment provides only temporary relief before the underlying uncertainty reasserts itself and demands the next proof, and the next, in an escalating cycle that has no natural stopping point built into it. The leader who no longer needs to prove themselves has not simply accumulated enough achievements to finally feel secure. They have done the separate, harder work of resolving the underlying uncertainty directly, so that external proof is no longer what their sense of worth depends on. The paradigm shift at the very end of this book is the deepest one. The version of power this entire text has been describing is not, in the end, a set of tactics you perform. It is a state you eventually inhabit, in which the tactics become unnecessary because the insecurity they were compensating for has genuinely resolved. The 90% rule, the silent 60, the 24-hour hold. All of these are training wheels for a mind that has not yet fully internalized its own security. Practice consistently enough for long enough, they stop being effortful techniques and simply become how you are, because the underlying need to prove anything to anyone has quietly, finally, gone still. For final practices, support this last, deepest transition. The first is the honest inventory of compulsive proving. Identify, honestly, the specific situations where you still feel a sharp, disproportionate need to demonstrate your competence or correct someone's underestimation of you. These situations are diagnostic. They point directly to the specific pockets of unresolved insecurity still operating underneath your accomplishments, and naming them accurately is the necessary first step before they can actually be resolved rather than simply managed. The second is sitting and being underestimated. Deliberately practice allowing yourself to be underestimated in low-stakes situations without correcting the record, and notice what actually happens. In almost every case, nothing bad happens. The moment passes, the underestimation causes no real damage, and you are left with direct, embodied evidence that your worth did not, in fact, depend on that person's accurate assessment of you. This evidence, accumulated experientially rather than just understood intellectually, does more to dissolve the compulsion to prove than any amount of reasoning about it in the abstract. The third is separating identity from achievement. Build deliberately a sense of who you are that does not depend on your most recent win, title, or piece of recognition, through relationships, practices, and values that remain stable regardless of professional outcomes. A leader whose identity is entirely fused with their achievements will always need the next achievement to feel secure. A leader whose identity has roots elsewhere can hold professional success and failure alike, without either one determining their fundamental sense of worth. The fourth is letting the record speak without you. In moments where you feel the pull to remind a room of your history, your credentials, or your past wins, practice simply not doing it and trusting that the people who need to know already know, and the people who don't will find out eventually or won't. And either way, it will not have been because you had to tell them. This is the practical, moment-to-moment expression of everything this final chapter describes, and it is available to you the very next time the impulse to prove yourself arises. This is where the book ends and where your actual practice begins, because everything written here was never meant to be finished, only started. The leader who doesn't need to prove it is not a leader who has stopped growing, stopped caring, or stopped striving. They're a leader who has simply stopped needing the room's applause to know what is already true. They walk in quiet. They leave a weight behind them anyway. And long after they've left, the room is still arranged, faintly and permanently, around the shape of someone who never once had to raise their voice to be heard. This is power without noise. Not the absence of strength, but strength that finally stopped needing an audience to be real. You have the tools now. The rest, as it always was, is quiet, patient, unglamorous practice, and it is yours. The final proof of power is that it no longer needs to prove anything at all. Power without noise. Recommendations and conclusion. This book was never meant to be read once and shelved. Each chapter contains a working system, a specific, repeatable practice, and systems only produce results through repetition, not through a single read-through. If you take nothing else from these 15 chapters, take this. Choose 3 systems, not all 15, and practice only those 3 for the next 90 days before adding anything else. The 90% rule, the silent 60, and the 24-hour hold are a strong, low-friction starting point for most readers. But choose whichever 3 spoke most directly to the gap you already know exists in your own leadership. A recommended path for revisiting this book. Read it once straight through, as you have just done, to understand the full architecture. Then return to it a second time, 1 chapter per week, treating each chapter as a 15-week training program rather than a 15-chapter book. Keep a private journal, even a few lines a day, tracking where you practiced restraint, where you protected your silence before a decision, where you chose the unglamorous system over the visible spectacle. The specific habit of tracking your own practice is, itself, one of the highest leverage actions available to you, because it turns abstract principle into measurable behavior you can actually improve over time. For leaders managing teams, consider selecting 1 chapter per month to discuss openly with your direct reports, not as a mandate, but as a shared language for the kind of leadership culture you're trying to build together. Quiet power is easier to sustain when it is not a solitary discipline, but a shared standard that a whole team recognizes and reinforces in each other, chapter by chapter, system by system. The central argument of this book, stripped down to its simplest form, is this: the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful one, and the leaders who last, whose influence survives their absence, whose teams hold the standard without supervision, whose legacy gets carried forward by people who never even needed to be told to carry it, are almost always the ones who built their authority quietly, through consistency rather than volume, through systems rather than spectacle, through restraint rather than reaction. This is not the easier path. It requires more discipline than loudness ever did, and it pays out on a longer timeline than most professional cultures are built to reward. But it is the only kind of power that has ever actually lasted in any organization, in any era, once the noise of the moment has finally gone quiet. You now have a complete system. What happens next depends entirely on what you do with it when no one is watching, which, fittingly, is exactly where this kind of power has always been built. Power without noise is not achieved. It is practiced quietly for as long as you keep choosing it. Power without noise.